The topic today is one which certainly is beyond my ability to address. Fortunately, Swami Kriyananda has in the reading this week. And I just wanted to read the expanded version of what Swami quoted from the Gospel of St. John. This is verses 6 through 14. There was a man sent from God, whose name was John. The same came for a witness, to bear witness of the light, that all men through him might believe. He was not that light, but was sent to bear witness of that light. That was the true light, that lighteth every man that come into the world. He was in the world, and the world was made by him, and the world knew him not. He came unto his own, and his own received him not. But as many as received him, to them gave he power to become the sons of God, even to them that believe on his name, which were born not of blood, nor of the will of the flesh, nor of the will of man, but of God. And the Word was made flesh, and dwelt among us, and we beheld his glory, the glory as of the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth. As I was contemplating this talk this week and thinking about how to start, the reading just gave me a whole new appreciation of the Festival of Light, which we do every week, written by Swami Kriyananda. It's the story of a little bird who goes out from its home in God and goes into the world and thinks he's pretty hot stuff for a while. And then gradually realizes through life's trials that there's more to this than just his own power. And that by going through these trials, he's forced to draw on that power, which begins to lift him and lift his consciousness to where he can approach back to God again. So this cycle is something that we've all gone through many times, and we're all striving to achieve that spark of divinity within us that we know is there, that we all feel, and which guides all of us through the ups and downs of life and lifetimes. We feel that spark, leading us forward to where we have where we know that we belong to a greater reality, that our limited existence, this identity, this little Rick, isn't all that there is to it. I grew up, in the 50s and 60s, which is prehistory for some. By the time I was 15, I realized there's got to be something better than this. And, my immediate sights were set on getting out of the house. So that was the priority for a couple of years, and I got out of the house. I turned 19 washing dishes in a hotel in Germany. And life kind of evolved. There was a trip to Europe and then home again, and then there was still back to school. And there was that sense of there still has to be more than this, that there's just something here that's missing. I don't know what it is. I thought for a long time the Holy Grail was travel, that through travel one could become free of one's little identity. Well, in the words of a Buddhist author, wherever you go, there you are. So that's what I found, that after all these years and all these experiences traveling, I was still wind up with me. And it was in 1973, it was in the midst of the oil embargo, if any of you remember that, when it was difficult to get gas for cars and lines at gas stations were 20 cars long. I hitchhiked up to Washington State to visit my aunt up in Bellingham. It was the first time I'd been to Washington, and I got a ride out with a friend who was going to Missoula and dropped out somewhere in eastern Washington. And I just remember this limitless expanse of snowy ground, blue sky, and cold, cold weather, not unlike today. And after visiting my aunt there, I then took off across country to New York. I was headed to New York to fly to Europe, which at the time was the cheapest way was Icelandic Airlines. Some of you may remember that as well. It was the low-cost way across the Atlantic. And I stopped to visit friends and family along the way, hitchhiking across the United States in winter, which was fairly cold. But one of the more interesting stops was in southern Illinois, where my grandparents lived. And Grandpa had been a Methodist minister all his life, and he had chaplained during the war, and he'd retired to a little town in southern Illinois in the midst of the soybeans and cornfields. He had 20 acres of mixed woods, hardwoods, and the hardwoods included a lot of sugar maples. And Grandpa's dream had always been to make maple syrup. And he had these 20 acres with a lot of maples, and that's what he did. And I think we're all used to maple syrup as something we see on a label in a store, in a bottle or a can with some, snowy ground and a bucket hanging from a tree, and a sled where it's gathered and taken back to be made into syrup. Well, Grandpa was modern. He had plastic tubing. And the way the maple syrup is made is by drilling a hole in the bark of the maple tree. And depending how big the tree is, it can take up to 3 taps, as they call them. And a little tree gets 1, the biggest one gets 3. And I've helped him drill a lot of these taps. And I remember drilling one day, and he was saying, you can drill as many holes as you want to in that tree, but you won't get any maple syrup. And I said, why not? He said, it's a hickory. So you kind of had to know what you were doing. But so there was all these taps on all these trees, and he built his cookhouse at the lowest point in the property. And when the nights are cold, freezing, and the days are warm, the sap starts to rise in the trees and would start flowing down through all these plastic tubes, down into larger pipes, down to where he had basically a stock tub, a big metal tank where all this stuff gathered. And when the sap was flowing at full strength, it was like turning on a garden hose full bore, a big garden hose. It was just a stream that would, shoot out like 6 or 8 feet. So he pumped all this up into the cookhouse where he had a wood-fired pan, as he called it. It was, imagine like a ping pong table and a half, laid out with burning wood down below it. And he spent all his summer cutting wood. Grandpa he was probably 70, 75 at the time. He could outwork me any day. Where he maintained a steady temperature, and the tank was just slightly inclined, so that as the syrup heated, or the saps heated and the water evaporated, the syrup became heavier and slowly slid down to the bottom of the tank, where he'd take a special instrument, a hygrometer, to measure the density, and when the density was right, then he tapped it off. Well, Grandpa he made about 55 gallons of maple syrup that year. That's as big as an oil drum. And Grandpa ate maple syrup on everything. He ate maple syrup on his eggs. There was maple syrup to go with all. So, you may be asking, well, this interesting story, maple syrup and all that, what's this got to do with Sunday service at Ananda? Good question. I think the main thing is that, well, let me branch out into come back to that question. This is another anecdote from growing up in California, where when I was in high school, we had a creek running behind the house. And behind the creek was the hills going out to Mount Diablo. It was a great place for a teenager, lots of place to run around. But the creek was like in California, you have a dry season and a rainy season, kind of like what Washington is getting to be. But when it rained down there, it rained a lot. It didn't rain for months on end, but when it rained, it poured. And we would get these atmospheric rivers in the day, we called them the Pineapple Express, that would just cause the little creek behind the house to become like this raging cappuccino-colored torrent. It's just all muddy water just racing along. But then during the summer, it would slow down and it would actually dry up and disappear. And then there'd be pools around. And then these pools, of course, we spent all our time exploring in the creek. In the pools, when the water got still, there'd be these little water skeeters. These little, they call them water striders, I guess is the correct name. They're up, if you go up to Hardsong, there's some in the fish pond there that kind of scoot around on the top of the water. And it's, how do they do that? How do they walk on water? We read that Christ walked on water, but we gather that's a little different. But the water skeeters take advantage of a property of the surface of water called surface tension. And it's kind of like, you can take a cloth, and if you stretch it real tight, like on a trampoline, you can walk on it. And it's the same thing for the water skeeters, that they're able to scoot over the surface of this tension and never go into the water beneath. Well, that's a little bit what our issue is too, is we have this thing called the ego, which is me, my sense of Rick, separate from everything else. I, my, me, mine as the lyrics to a refrain from one of Swami's song goes, where we have this sense of yearning to have that greater identity, to achieve that greater identity, and yet at the same time, we're kind of stuck, or speaking, maybe it's just me, I'm stuck with this identity of Rick, and what do I do about it? So there's where our water skeeter analogy comes in, is that a lot of the time, what keeps us hemmed into our identities is the sense of, one, tension, and two, busyness. That we avoid looking more deeply into our own lives by staying busy. Whether it's washing the dishes or doing this or that, because at the same time that we have this yearning to go deep, there's a hesitancy. And it's often that it isn't until life comes along and dunks us into the water real good that we realize that there's more to this than just being tense and being on the surface of things. And that the real reality, our real reality, is deeper within. So where we go to, coming back to the maple syrup, is like, okay, so what do we do? How do we eventually, if we come from God, as we read in the Gospel of St. John, how do we go back? How do we return? And that's kind of where we're all at. And we're all in various stages along the way. And the main thing that we have to remember is that we're, as Carol read in today's affirmation, energy. That we are energy and we're surrounded by God's energy. And our goal is to merge the two, so that we become that energy of God, that we become that light of God. And it's a gradual process. Some of us maybe achieve it very quickly, others of us take a while. But the main thing is, like with the maple syrup, is all of that sap is potential energy. Refined, or rather concentrated, it becomes syrup, it becomes sweet, and it becomes collected and can be directed. So instead of putting our energies outward to the world, to all the beautiful trees and all the leaves and all the activities and all the things that we do and want and on, we begin to learn to direct our energy inward. And what's the main way that we do that? Here, it's meditation. We find that as we go deeper within, we have our own experience of something deeper within us. And it calls to us, and when we achieve it, for however long, it feels like home. It feels like ours. It feels native. So the process of gradually bringing our awareness and our energy into, as we call it, the inner spine, and then raising that energy up through higher levels of consciousness. And for those who've done Raja Yoga class, it would be, you're familiar with the chakras, to where we identify less with that which goes on around us and more with what we're experiencing within. And it can be a real challenge. There's many, what did Christ say, in my house are many mansions. I'm not sure exactly what that means, but certainly as we come through our own lives, we realize that we have many different aspects to us. That was listening to a fascinating Whispers talk by Swami Kriyananda from sometime back in the 80s, where he was talking about the Mahabharata as an allegory of where there's two opposing forces, the Pandavas and the Kauravas, and it's the battle of light and dark, the battle of good and evil that actually takes place within all of us with all these different aspects of ourselves, which in the Bhagavad Gita and the Mahabharata are aspects of our personality. Each one is named. And Swami's point was very interesting. He said that as we begin to get to know our mental citizens, as it were, the rowdy ones, the uplifted ones, the reluctant ones, et cetera, that we begin to work with them. And his point was very interesting. He said that many of the qualities that we develop in the outside world for relating to people and for involving people in what we do are the same things that we can bring inside and use in our own challenged world with corralling our inner citizens to all start working in the same direction. And that's really what we're talking about, is that we can gather our energies and we can direct our energies towards something that's going to make us happier. And we know instinctively, we wouldn't be here otherwise, that that's God, however we define it. But that the real goal is somewhere, it's both within and it's beyond us. So when we have our own experiences, and I was just thinking of experience of my own in the Himalayas. This was on the second trip to India. The trip to New York and across the Atlantic turned out to be 7 years long, included 2 trips to India. And on the second one, I had been up to some of the Hindu and Sikh holy places up above Rishikesh, up to Badrinath, and to a lake that's sacred to the Sikh tradition, the Hemkud Sahib. And this lake is up at 11,000 feet. And as any of you backpackers know, lakes at that altitude can be pretty cold. But it's a purification process that we do. The pilgrims go to this lake and dunk themselves 3 times into this water. And it gets your attention for sure. And I did it, and as I was coming back down, I realized, somehow or other I didn't do that right. Somehow I was resisting something. So I went back down the mountain and then came back a couple weeks later and did it more wholeheartedly this time, of just somehow being willing to be purified in the process. And the water was still cold. There's no question of that. But as I was coming back down the mountain and waiting for the bus that was to take me down to Rishikesh, a man came up to me. And he said, "A saint wants to talk to you." And I said, a saint? You know, I didn't really have too much of a clue of what saints were. And so I fumbled around getting my backpack all ready for the bus and so forth, and then went over to see what this guy was talking about. And there was a man standing there who was just quiet. He was quite clear. And he asked me the question, well, why are you traveling? And, you know, I came out with some kind of tourist book answer, well, to see the sights and see how people live around the world and so forth. And he was unimpressed. He just looked at me again and said, why are you traveling? And at this point, I began to realize there was something else going on. And I came out with something like, well, I'm trying to learn about myself. And he looked at me again and he said, why are you traveling? And at this point, I was almost in tears. It was clear that he was onto something that was beyond me yet. And he could see that, and he just looked at me and he said, why don't you go down and sit at the feet of someone who's got something to teach you? And that's what I did. I went down and I took my first class in meditation, and that was really the beginning of being consciously on the spiritual path. So a lot of times, you know, we instinctively know the way, but we need help getting there. We need the advice, we need the insight, and sometimes we need the, how should we say, forceful involvement of others in our process, because the shell of ego is not always easy to break open. And it's not something that we willingly relinquish. Some of you may know that geology is one of my interests. Certainly my wife Christy does. But several years ago, this is going back 20, 30 years, I was down in the Yucatan, which is in Mexico, sort of in southern Mexico near the Guatemala border. And the Yucatan is a giant area of limestone. We don't have much of it here in Washington, but if you go back east, there's lots of it. It's like there's full of little, you know, fossils and things like that. But one of the things about limestone is that water can dissolve it. And all the great caverns here in the United States, Carlsbad Caverns and so forth, are all formed by water dripping through limestone, dissolving limestone, making all these fabulous rock formations underground. Well, in the Yucatan, it's a little bit different. It's like if you imagine a big flat area, or imagine an apple, and you take an apple core and, you know, you round out the center. Well, that's what you have in the Yucatan, is these great big cores of place where the ground is gone, where the rock is gone, and you've got water. You've got a perfectly round lake, and it may be 100 yards across, it may be a quarter mile across, and they call them cenotes. And the interesting thing is when you go swimming in one of these cenotes, the water's warm, it's quite interesting to swim. You go out from shore and you turn around and you look back at the wall, and there, as far as you can see going down into the depths, is just this wall of limestone with roots coming out of it and so forth. And it's a very interesting thing. If you face that wall, it goes on forever. If you face the water, you can swim forward. And that's really kind of where we're at too, is the wall of ego. I've heard it described as a reef, which is something where within us we can feel it sometimes when we're coming from ego, that it feels hard, it feels rough, it feels defensive. And we get to know as we go and gradually get more experience of the inner world, we begin to know when we're coming from that place versus coming from a higher place or a lighter place. And the choice that we have, much like the water skier, is whether we just sit there on the surface, you know, looking at the rocks and the roots and, you know, the diffusion of the light through the water, or whether we get out there and start swimming. So, you know, to conclude, it's really we have we have the choice in every moment of how we react. As saints have said, I believe Sister Gyanamata said something along those lines, is like, it's not what happens to us in life that's important, but what we make of it. I'm paraphrasing it, it may be the wrong person, but the point is very valid. It's like what comes to us comes of itself, comes of our karma many times. How we meet that test, how we react to it. Do we get defensive? Are we welcoming? Are we resisting? Do we deny it? Or do we just raise our energy as best we can to deal with it? And these aren't easy things that come to us. They're often challenges that hit us to our core. And they force us somehow through the process, through our reaction, and sometimes taking some pretty big hits in the process, to begin to be willing to look beyond our self-definitions and what we thought was the way things are. And really where our true home is in that light of that St. John wrote of, the infinite Christ. And that the energy that we get and the experiences that we get can help us along the way. And like the little bird that we'll read about shortly in the Festival of Light, in the beginning, he's all about himself. Hey, I can do it. I'm all here. I can manage this. This is great. And then, after some encounters with big storms, it's like, I'm not so sure about this. Am I gonna make it? And then, the support comes. The support comes from the universe and from the divine. And that for us is what it's really all about, is drawing more on that sense of the divine within us and actively seeking where our happiness lies. And we know, and sometimes we need the courage to go forth. There's a wonderful affirmation of Yogananda's. It's actually for prosperity, but it applies in many ways. It's, I will go forth in perfect faith in the power of omnipresent good to bring me what I need at the time I need it. So we can expand our definition of prosperity to include our greater happiness, and to just know that wherever we are and whatever we're going through, the Divine Mother is there with us, and that she will be there with us, and that she always has been there with us to guide us home. God bless us all.